We make choices every day. Some of them are small and some of them are big. Some of them we give very little thought to, and some of them we give much consideration. Some of them are really no big deal at all, and others are life-changing. For example, I didn't give much thought at all to what socks I was going to wear today. I gave it a little, but not much. You know why? It's not really life-changing, is it? However, if you're thinking about things like what job am I going to do? What career am I going to go into? Where am I going to live? Who am I going to marry? Now, those are life-changing decisions. And so those decisions, we don't just jump into them. We don't take it lightly, but we take them very seriously. And we want to make a good decision, a good choice. And so when we come to those things, we may weigh the pros and cons. Make a list. Well, this is what would be good about the decision. This is what would be bad about that decision. And we may look at it and say, well, is it good? We may talk to others and get advice, but we take it very seriously. But the most important choices that we have to make in this life have to do with our relationship with God and with our faith. How carefully do you consider those choices? Our passage today gives us the opportunity to think about these things and then to make a choice. Joshua will present several challenges to the people of Israel. But before each challenge, he reminds them of the facts they need to consider before making the choice. And all of those facts point to the idea that God is faithful. So we began, the first one is that God is faithful. And Joshua says, so obey him. Chapter 23, beginning in verse 1 through 8. It says, a long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all those nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight. And you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. So as Joshua begins to speak, we see that a lot of time has passed and Joshua is old. Now earlier, we remember God said Joshua, you're getting old. But at this point, he is really old. He's probably about 110 years old. And he's coming close to the point of dying. He's coming to the end of his life. And so he gathers all these leaders of Israel together. And when he gathers them together, he reminds them of God's faithfulness, and he reminds them of their responsibility as God's people. And that responsibility would be to be faithful to God, to be faithful to their faithful God. But these are his last words, if you will. These are the final instructions of a dying leader. And that means that these are the things that he would consider to be the most important things to say. These are the things that he says, these are the things that I just got to tell you. Before I go, you need to hear this. So these are important things that he's telling the people of Israel now. His last words. And he begins by saying, God is faithful. And he says this because he says, God promised you this land. And what did he do? He gave it to you. He fought for us, he says. That God fought for us and he caused us to conquer the people of this land, all the inhabitants of the land. And he gave us this land. And when Joshua says this, he says to them, he goes, you saw it. He says, you saw all that the Lord, or have seen all that the Lord has done. And when he tells them this, he's saying, you are witnesses to the facts. You saw it with your own eyes, what God did. You know how God gave you this victory. You saw God give you these victories over these nations. And you know that it wasn't by your own strength or by your own wisdom or by your own prowess or military prowess that you won these battles. But it was by God's strength. It was by God's wisdom. It was because of God that you won. So he says, you saw it and you know it. And therefore you have a responsibility or an obligation to respond well to what you know. But what is the expected response? What does Joshua expect them to do? Well, it's to be faithful to God, to obey Him. In verse 6 he says, therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is in the law of the Lord your God. Be very strong to keep and do all that is in the law. And he says this, he says, how much of the law? He said all of it. In other words, he's looking for complete obedience to God here. Not just partial obedience, but complete obedience. In fact, he goes on and he emphasizes this by saying, making sure that you don't turn to the right or to the left. In other words, don't go off the path. And it's a picture, again, we can use this picture of a path. If you're walking down a path or a street, it's like stay in the center of it. Don't go to the right of it. Don't go to the left of it. So if you're coming up to a curve in the road and say, hey, I could take a shortcut. I'm going to just... No, don't do that. You stay on the path and follow the path. Don't just get lazy or sleepy and drift. You know how people drive, and you've seen the people and they're driving, next thing you know, they're kind of getting closer and closer. And then they hit those rumble strips and wake up and move back over. He says, don't do that. Don't just fade off the path. And don't deliberately choose, I'm going to walk off the path. He says, you be very careful. You make sure that you stay on the path, that you do God's law, that you obey Him without going off to one side or the other, but you stay centered in God's law and be obedient to Him. But catch, he also says, be very strong to do this. And again, we saw this phrase before, but what he means by this is that you need to be resolved and be strong to make sure that you'll do it. Be strong, be resolved, so you will not cave into pressure from outside forces, from outside people who try and say, that's not the way you should do, or you should live like us. Because the world is always around us telling us those things. You should be like us. Don't hold to those. That's not a sin. That's not wrong. You should think the way we think. But Joshua says, be very strong, that you don't go to the right or the left, that you hold firmly to God's truth and God's law. Don't cave into the pressure. Don't cave into their wrong ideas. But see, the thing is that they could very easily be tempted to fall into those ideas of their neighbors. Their neighbors are all around them, and their neighbors didn't know God, neither did they obey God. And so Joshua says, be strong. Be very strong. Resolve and stand up. We might say, be a man. But resolve and stand up and be strong, that you will not cave into those pressures. And I read this and I can't help thinking that this sounds very familiar. Because, we have pressures all around us. Our world is constantly telling us, that's what you believe? That's crazy. In fact, that's wrong. And we have to say, no, God is right, and we're standing on His truth, and we are going to be faithful to His word and His truth, no matter what comes from the outside. And so Joshua says, be strong. And that means that we need to be strong. But how can we be strong in a world that pressures us to turn from God's ways? Well, Joshua tells us in verse 8, he says, cling to your God. He says, cling to God. And we talked about this again when this is the same thing he told the eastern tribes when they were heading home. He said, cling to God. And it has that picture of holding so tightly to God that nothing can cause you to drift away from Him. So hold so tightly to God that even if you're pushed, you're not going to get away. You cling to Him and you hold on to Him so that nothing can cause you to drift or nothing can come between you and God. And when I was in high school, I had these two friends that were a couple, this guy and the girl, and they were always holding hands. I mean, they were always holding hands. But one time, I came up behind them and I saw they weren't holding hands. And I jumped in between them and put my arm, and I thought, I never thought I'd come in between you. And I know it's an absolutely goofy joke, but it illustrates my point. There was my opportunity. The one time I saw them not holding hands, I jumped right in between them. But we cling to God, and we give nothing the opportunity to get in between us. We let nothing come in to cause us to drift away from Him or fall away. We cling to God. So Joshua says here that God is faithful, so you need to obey Him. Secondly, he says God is faithful, so love Him. Let's continue reading chapter 23, verse 9 through 13. It says, "For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as He promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your side, and thorns in your eyes." And that sounds terrible. "But thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you." So again, Joshua begins by saying God is faithful. Again, God has been helping you. He helped you take this land. And he specifically talks about how they had victory over these stronger enemies. These enemies who actually had stronger militaries and stronger armies than Israel had. But he says, but the people of the land, they weren't pushovers. But they were actually strong. But yet you were able to conquer them. In fact, he says that one Israelite was able to put 1,000 to cause 1,000 to flee. In other words, Israel was very successful, and they scared those people, those stronger armies. But the reason for it? Very simple. Because God was fighting for them. That's what he says very clearly. God was fighting for you, and that is why you did well. God is faithful. But what is the expected response to God's faithfulness? He says, you need to love Him. Love Him. And when he tells them to love Him, he's talking about more than just an emotional response or just that emotional kind of affection. And I think that's part of it, that we have that affection towards God and that emotion towards God. But he needs more than just the emotional affection. How do I know that? Because he says here, be very careful to love. Now I know usually emotional love kind of just happens. But if you are very careful to do something, that means you're being purposeful about it. And so he's saying, be very careful to love the Lord your God. And so he says, this is a choice that you have to make. This is a decision that you have to make. And he's talking about that affection for God that is bound up in commitment to Him. He's saying, you be devoted to God. And when he says, be very careful, he's saying, you need to guard yourself. Make absolutely sure that you are devoted to God in love. Now that positive commandment, though, to make sure to love Him, is the balance with an opposite negative commandment. And that opposite negative commandment is simply, don't join yourself to the sinful people that remain in your land. And he illustrates this with the possibility of them intermarrying with the people of the land. And talks about how that would not be a good thing. But when he talks about this marriage, we see that what he's talking about when he says not associating with them, he's talking about a close association, an association that involves devotion or binding yourself to these people. Because if you bind yourself to these sinful people, on one hand, you'll be disobeying simply because God told you not to. But you also will be then turning from God and following their ways rather than God's ways. You will be binding to yourself to them and breaking your commitment to God and failing to love God. And Joshua says, if you fail to love God and you bind yourself to these other people instead, then God won't drive out the remaining inhabitants. God won't fight for you any longer. In fact, they'll stay there and they'll become big problems for you. And he uses these words. He says they will be a snare and a trap for you. And we know a snare and a trap meaning they will lead people away from God and into judgment. But I think this also could be taken in a literal sense, that they become a trap for them, that they will actually capture and enslave the Israelites, which we know from Israel's history that will happen to some of them. They will be captured and enslaved. But they will become a snare and a trap. But he also says they'll be a whip to your side and thorns in your eyes. I don't even like getting dust in my eyes, let alone thorns. But they will be thorns in your eyes. But the picture here is that they will bring pain and suffering to you. Now the interesting thing is if the Israelites were to turn away from God, they would be doing it because they were seeking something that they thought was better. They would be doing it because they thought, if I do this, my life will be better. This is what I want. This will bring me pleasure. But in the end, it won't bring them pleasure. It'll bring them pain. So that happy ending that they're looking for, that happy ending, it turns into a terrible ending. And it brings suffering because they will suffer the consequences of their sin till the day they die. Well, speaking of consequences, this leads us to the third point. God is faithful, so don't reject Him. Chapter 23, verse 14. And now I'm about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until He has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that He has given you. This part of the speech comes with a warning. And he puts this extra emphasis on this part by saying, hey, I'm about to die. In other words, this is important. Listen. And he says, God is faithful. He has kept all His promises. He says there's not one thing that He hasn't done, that He promised you that He didn't do. He's kept all His promises. But then He continues on. He says, and He will keep all of His promises. Now, which ones? All of them. But that includes not only the blessings, the good things, but also the curses, the bad things. Because God had told them, when He made the covenant with them, He says, if you obey me, I will bless you. But if you disobey me and follow other gods, I will curse you. And so they have a choice to make. But he says, your choice is going to depend on how God responds. But he says, but God is faithful to keep His promises. Whether they're positive promises or negative promises, whether it brings good or whether it brings bad, God is faithful and He will keep His promises. And so the expected response is very simple. So don't reject God. Don't turn away from Him to worship other gods, to worship idols. Now we read this and we think, well, that seems easy, right? I mean, we know God and we know the Israelites, they knew God. Why would they even consider doing something? And we hear these and we think that's so ridiculous. It's kind of ludicrous. How would they ever turn from God to worship an idol, to worship some piece of stone or a piece of metal or a piece of wood? It just doesn't make much sense. However, as you read this, it's very clear that Joshua is much more concerned about this than he is about some enemy coming and attacking them. He's very much more concerned about the Israelites turning from God than he is about them standing up to some physical enemy. The spiritual ideas or the spiritual attack. This is what he's warning them about. And so it's an issue. It's a threat. And it's a greater threat than the threat of battle. Consider these things for a minute. Before Israel came into the land, before God gave them the land and brought them into the land that he had promised them, there were nomads. They were herdsmen or shepherds. They were people who traveled around and kept flocks and herds. They were not farmers. When they came into the land, what did they become? Farmers. They were still shepherds and herdsmen, but they became farmers. They now had land to farm. Now they may have planted some gardens or something before or different things along the way, but now they had land that was theirs and they could grow crops. They became farmers. Well, the people who lived in the land before them were already farmers. The people who were still in the land, who had not yet been removed, were farmers. And they had certain skills. And they had certain ways of doing things and certain ways of farming. And maybe they had different ideas and they could show pointers and that kind of thing. But one of the things that the people of the land did is they worshiped a god named Baal. And Baal was believed, a false god I should say, but a false god named Baal. And Baal was believed to control rain and to control the storms and to give good crops. And so the people of the land would pray to Baal and they would serve Baal and they would worship Baal. And part of their reasoning for doing that was to have good crops. It was part of their farming techniques. Now the people of Israel, you say, well, that doesn't matter anything because now the Israelites know, well, we're going to be farmers, but God promised them, I'll give you good crops. However, now they're living in this land and their neighbors are all worshiping this Baal who supposedly helps them have good crops. And so they hear this and they hear these ideas. But we think, well, the Israelites know better, they'll never do that. But after prolonged exposure to these ideas and prolonged interaction with these people and hearing over and over that Baal gives good crops, that temptation slowly and subtly creeps in. And they start thinking, well, maybe we should do that. I mean, these guys are farmers, and they prayed, maybe we should do that. Maybe that's the right thing to do. And you start being misled by this idea and this ideology that's all around you. Until the point where it eventually sounds reasonable. And then it becomes appealing because you're thinking, well, I need good crops. This will be helpful. And then you finally choose to sin. And in their case, to worship a false god. And that's how it begins. You see, they never would have considered it. They knew God, and they worshiped God alone. They never would consider worshiping some idol. But with that idea all around them, eventually becomes reasonable, sounds helpful, you choose to sin. But isn't that just exactly how sin creeps into the life of a Christian? And exactly how sin creeps into the life of the church? We have people all around us. We are bombarded with worldly ideologies, with worldly thoughts, with the way they think. We are bombarded by those people who say, no, that's not a sin. No, that's not a sin. No, you shouldn't do this. No, you're wasting your time on Sunday morning. Why do you do this? And we are bombarded. We hear those ideas. They're all around us. And they tell us, you should do this instead, or you should have this and this and this. You need to have this and this and this. And we hear these ideas all the time. And eventually, you turn away from God and reject Him and follow the sinful ways of the world. And Joshua says, don't do it. God is faithful. So you stay faithful to Him. Don't turn away from Him. Don't follow those ideas of the people around you. But when we do, when God's children do, in the same way that God took Israel out of the land, to teach them to worship Him alone. And the way He punished them and took them out of the land to teach them to worship Him alone and not to worship idols. God is faithful to discipline His children. Hebrews tells us that He disciplines those whom He loves. And He will discipline us to bring us back to Him, to turn us back to a right relationship with Him, so that we will be obedient and faithful to Him. So we've seen that God is faithful. And so we need to obey Him, we need to love Him, and we need to make sure we don't reject Him. And fourthly, God is faithful, so faithfully serve Him. Chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. It says, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess. But Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it. And afterwards I brought you out. Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, He put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come up upon them, and covered them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. And you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and invited Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Indeed, he blessed you, so I delivered you out of his hand. And you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I gave them into your hand. And I sent the hornets before you, which drove them out before you, the two kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your father served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in the land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, we don't know exactly how much time has passed between the previous verses and here in chapter 24. But Joshua calls the people together again. He gathers the people again one last time. And he gives them a brief review of Israel's history. The entire history. And he does this to show them that God is faithful. And the emphasis in all of this history is on God. I don't know if you noticed as I read, but over and over it said, I did this. And it's God speaking. I did this. I gave you. I sent you. See, God is faithful. He's been faithful over hundreds of years to Israelites at this point. Over many generations. And Joshua tells them this expecting a response. And the response is that they would choose to faithfully serve God. That they would choose to faithfully serve their God, the one true God, their faithful God. That they would choose to serve Him and worship Him alone. Of course, he says, or you could make the wrong choice and choose to serve the idols that your fathers did, or the ones that they served in Egypt. see as he says this that the choice is clear. There's one good choice. But they had to make it, and then they had to act upon it. And Joshua makes it clear, he's not looking for lip service here. He's not looking for some half-hearted commitment. Because he says, you need to serve the Lord in sincerity and in faithfulness. He's looking for a wholehearted commitment. He's looking for undivided allegiance to God. Not giving part of yourself to this God and to the real God. Not kind of dividing up and saying, well, I'm going to serve this and this. But that you give yourself fully and completely to God. And that there is nothing else in God's place in your life. And then Joshua takes a stand. He says, you choose, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he tells us this. He tells them this to, on one hand, to encourage them to make the right choice. You need to do what is right. But he also is making it very clear that no matter what anyone else decides, no matter what you do or you do or you do, me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He takes a stand and he says, this is right and this is what we will do, and nothing will deter me from following my God. Do you have that kind of resolve? That nothing will deter you from following your God and serving your faithful God. God is faithful. And so now it's time to make a choice. Will you faithfully and wholeheartedly serve the Lord? Now, it could be very easy to just quickly say, oh yeah. And actually that appears to be maybe what the Israelites did. So let's keep reading in chapter 24, verse 16. It says, then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us all the way that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the people of the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we will serve the Lord, for he is our God. That's a good answer. In fact, it seems it's a very quick and enthusiastic answer. We'll definitely serve Yahweh. We're definitely going to serve our God. He's our God. And we'll never reject him. We'll never turn away from him. Like I said, that's a good answer. But Joshua seems to sense maybe some insincerity in their answer, or maybe that they answered too quickly and he's not quite sure. Maybe he's thinking it was just an emotional response and they haven't really carefully considered the commitment that they're making. And so he says in verse 19, it says, but Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And when Joshua says this, he's not just being negative. He's not kind of just being defeatist and saying, there's no way you can do that. But he's wanting to make them think. He wants them to understand what it really means to be faithful to a holy God. He says, God is holy and you're not. But you are called to be holy. As his people, you are called to be holy. And that is the commitment that he's looking for, because that's what it means. To be faithful to a holy God would mean that you would be holy as well. And so he says, you are called to be called holy. And that is no small calling. In fact, it's huge. It's a big deal. The people answer in verse 21, and the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." He said, "Then put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, "Behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God." So Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. So the people respond to Joshua, "No, we really mean it. We really are committed to God." And Joshua responds, "Then do it. If you are really committed, then do it." And they say, "We will." And so Joshua renews the covenant with them, and he sets up this stone as a monument, as a reminder of the covenant that they made, of the commitment that they made. And he says it stands there as a testimony, as a witness of what we agreed to today. And then the following verses that are left in Joshua, the rest of the people go home. We're told about the burial of 3 men, of Joshua, of Joseph, and Eleazar the priest. 3 men who experienced God's faithfulness and who in turn were faithful to him. And then we get this statement in verse 31. It says, "Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the works that the Lord did for Israel." And I read that statement, and it's a very positive statement. But I can't help but get this sense, this ominous feeling that comes with it. And maybe it's just because I know the rest of Israel's history. But as I read this, you read it, it's very positive. They followed God. As long as Joshua and those men who actually saw what God did were alive. And there's just this ominous feeling that faithfulness ended at that point. Of course, you have to read on into Judges and 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings to find out what happens. But today, we know that God is faithful. Right? We know that God is faithful. He's been faithful to Israel. He's faithful to us. He is faithful to all of his promises. And I think a God, faithful God, who loved us and sent his son Jesus to die in our place so that we could have a relationship with him. You know, Jesus didn't have to come and die for us. God didn't have to send Jesus, except his love compelled him to. But he sent Jesus to die in our place because God is good and faithful. But that same God has called us to faithfully serve him with a whole heart, not divided, not giving our allegiance partially to him and partially to others, but to serve him faithfully and wholeheartedly with undivided devotion. And this morning I want to ask a couple questions that I want you to consider. Is there anything in your life that is hindering you from being completely faithful to God? Is there anything in your life that is hindering you from being completely faithful to God? Secondly, is there anything that may challenge for God's place of priority in your life? Anything that you may be putting ahead of God or before God? Is there anything that's challenging for God's place of priority in your life? And thirdly, are you entertaining the ideas of the world that may cause you to fall away or turn from God and follow in the ways of the world? My answer, if you answered yes to any of those questions, is very simple. stop it. I can't get any more direct, any more simple. Stop it. Get rid of those things. That's what Joshua said. He says, okay, if you're going to do it, then get rid of those idols. And do it. If you're committing, then do it. It's time to make a choice. And I don't always do this, but I'm going to ask you now to bow your heads. Because I want you guys to all really think about this. I want you to truly consider what I'm saying here and what God is calling you to. And I'm going to give you a moment to think about these things. Understand what it is that God is calling you. Understand what this commitment is. Think carefully about it. And then choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.